projects are, which keywords do you think you would have necessarily to include in these definitions? So type away in the chat box. So during this webinar, I'll ask you some questions here and there, and they're really genuine questions. Feel free to engage and interact in the chat box along the way. I'll be trying to follow you up. But you can also add some questions, and then I'll be following so that I can answer them. And I can see some answers here already. Let me see: planning, organization, collaboration, engagement, creativity, twice. Students' idea, nice. Respect, engagement, interest, authenticity, research, students' ideas. Someone else from Minas. I saw someone from Florianópolis here as well. Do it yourself, maker, collaboration. Let me see what else. There's some people typing still. Let's see what it comes. Sharing ideas. Yes. All right. I'll show you 4 definitions of projects. And let's see if your ideas are there and if they match the words that I highlighted, because the words that I highlighted in these definitions are, for me, really important ones when you're talking about projects, right? So let's take a look at them, right? So the first one is by Susan Holden and Vinny, and I'll give you a moment to read. And here you already have something that you've mentioned more than once here, because quite a few people mentioned collaboration. So there is this idea of collaborative work. And there's also the idea of having a defined purpose. So why you are doing that. So when you're talking about projects, learners aren't supposed to be doing something just because. They are supposed to be doing something with a purpose. So these 2 words are really important, the way I see it, right? Next definition. This is shorter. This is by Bolke. So no one's afraid to read. And this is, as you can see, is a very generic explanation, right? But I like it because it makes it clear that a project should be longer. So if you have something that happens within a lesson, it's probably not a project. It can be TBL, maybe. It can be a task. It can be something, learners may be producing something, but if it happens self-contained in one single lesson, it's probably not a project, because projects demands something more, right? That's going to show up in a second. It can be part of a project, right, Adriana? That's it. So a project may happen over a couple of lessons. Maybe it doesn't have to be a sequence of like 3 full lessons, but no, it can be like parts of lessons as well, but it takes time, right? Next definition. This one here is by Scott Thornbury, and I'll give you a moment to read. All right, so keywords here, the idea of extending beyond the lesson again. here you start to see why it needs to extend beyond the lesson, right? So because it involves research and it involves the production of a final product, and that has to be presented. So how can we, in the same lesson, even if you're talking about a longer lesson, like 90 minutes or something like that, it would be quite ambitious and I'd say unrealistic to have learners to define the project, make all the research they need in order to develop and produce their final product and present. It would be really ambitious, not to say unrealistic. So that's a good reason why it should be extended over more than one lesson. Right? And the last one, this is by Tricia Hedge. The idea of extended task again. Having a goal, a purpose, as mentioned before. And I really like this definition because it has here the idea of planning. It has the idea of gathering information similar to research, as we had in Scott's definition. But here we have planning, and we have the idea of discussing the information gathered, problem solving, reporting, display, and then we start going deeper into skills that are needed for a project, right? So when you're talking about a project, we need to consider that it's not something like asking learners to make a poster at the end of the lesson. It is more complex than that. It involves planning and involves production. Because it involves planning, and now I'll start bringing teenagers here, it has some implications for the work to be developed with them. But I'll save that for later. It's a small teaser, right? So all of this, and you can see that you have 4 different definitions from 5 different professionals, authors in our area, and all of them are different. They are not contradictory, but they are different. So it's different from saying, okay, what's the definition of gamification? So gamification is bringing game elements to non-game situations. It's simple, it's there, it's clear. Projects are more complex than that, right? So the definition, I'd say it's really hard to put a definition in one sentence like that. So it's always nice to see how different people would define that, because each and everyone will highlight different aspects, and they are all important for us to really understand what a project entails, and later on during this webinar to understand how it impacts this match with teenagers, right? So far so good. Any comments? If you have, please type in the chat box. Apparently not. Okay, so just to wrap up these characteristics of projects, I want to highlight some of them, right? So first, projects are content focused. Even though we are language teachers, the focus of the project is on the content. The language is a tool to reach this, the purpose, the goal, to produce the final product, to communicate, but the focus is on the content. It is student-centered in that it depends a lot on, we should allow learners to make decisions, or else you are actually asking them to do some crafts, maybe, right? It is potentially motivating, stimulating, empowering, and challenging. Why do I say potentially? First, we can because people are different. So what motivates one learner may not motivate another one, but they are potentially motivated, stimulating, empowering, and challenging because of this voice that we give to learners, especially when you're talking about teenagers. And if we allow them to take control of their own learning process via projects, it will motivate them, stimulate them to go further, empower them to use the language to make their point, to actually grow as a citizen, and challenging. And when we think, I mentioned gamification before, but if we think of the flow, the game flow, that is a combination, if you think of a graph, right, of skills versus challenge. The more, if it's too challenging and you don't have the skills, it's going to be frustrating. If it's too easy, so no challenge at all compared to the skills, going to be boring. So projects can add this element of challenge. So if learners are doing just what they already know, the projects can tease them to go further. Okay, this you already know. What else can you find about it? Why don't you think from a different perspective? You can tease them to and add challenge by asking them to go further, really. It, from the language teacher's perspective, it's really interesting because it integrates skills naturally. So to produce a project, learners will need reading, definitely speaking, some listening because they are interacting with each other as well, right? And some writing for the planning. So we involve naturally all the skills. So the skills are not seen as little boxes, but they are seen as communication. So all of them will happen together. We need a final product, an end product, and it makes the project, not the project itself, but the learning process feel more concrete. So when you have this final product, is something you can show. And when we are talking about teenagers, it's something good for parents to see. Because if you're talking about young learners love sharing things with their parents. They will share things more naturally. And if we start asking them, what have you learned at school today, and this and that, they will respond more in a more interested way, right? However, teenagers don't like this kind of relationship with parents that much, that often. They usually refrain from giving too much information about their lives to parents. So if we have something concrete that they make, it's something parents can see, even if they don't want to ask, or the school can show parents as well if they ask. So it's something to make it real, right? And projects are collaborative and cooperative and people working together, which nowadays is something to be developed, because let's say that teenagers don't have, and children as well, and adults, why not, don't have a very good model of collaboration amongst people. I'd say that nowadays people are, although we have all this communication going on with social media and so on, we are trapped inside our bubbles. So we are used to this isolation, and projects can burst this bubble, right? So, and we're going to explore this idea of people's perspective in a second, right? All right, so these are some characteristics of projects that we need to have. But we have to keep in mind that different schools will have different contexts. And in one school or in another school, we have more or less freedom in order to develop projects. Teenagers will be more or less used to dealing with projects. Some of them, if you're teaching in a language institute, for example, you may have in the same group a teenager who's been working with projects in their own school, and others who come from a school in which projects don't happen there. So one part of your class will be used to projects, another one won't be that used. And if you're teaching in a mainstream school, your school can be more or less integrated with this concept of projects, right? Sometimes projects are just for special occasion, like Feira Cultural, for example. Sometimes it's fully integrated. It depends a lot on the context. And this is another beauty of projects. So, because they can have different configurations, right? So they can be more structured, less structured, or semi-structured, or unstructured. So we can play with levels of structure there. And what are levels of structure? What do I mean by that? I mean how much choice learners have. So, for example, take a look at this idea here of a project. How much choice do learners have? You can type in the chat box. Not much, right? They cannot choose the book because it's a book set by the school. So the school chooses. Yeah, I'd say I'd agree with Nicholas, who said that mostly the last part, right? So if they would recommend the book and why, right? So this is almost not a project, right? They can choose the tools, right? So it's almost not a project, but it still is, because you have some kind of choice, right? So it wouldn't be a project if it was, okay, do this, write a composition about the book, and that's it. And when you have to produce the podcast, you start to giving them more opportunities to choose, right? So they will decide who is going to talk. If everybody's going to talk, someone is going to be responsible for sound effects or not. So we have something going on there, but it's, yes, really limited, right? Take a look at this one. Now, compare how much choice they have. Mm-hmm. Yes, Ilana, teachers having a list, a start of list is always helpful. Yes, I agree with you, Bruno. It's always important to talk about collaboration explicitly with learners. We have to make things, we can talk to them, right? We don't have to hide we can help them see read the matrix, behind it. So it's fine to explain things, and I think it will help them a lot. Yeah, so here they have much more choice, right? But think a little bit. How much time will they need to do this project compared to this one? This is also something that you have to keep in mind, because the more choice and collaboration we give, the more time we will need to develop the project. And sometimes we don't have all that much time. So we can guide them a little bit more, a little bit less. Yes. So who mentioned that? Let me go back. I forgot. Ilana. Yes, as Ilana mentioned, we can start with a list of books. We can have, then it's easier for learners to go through that, so they don't have to come up with a book themselves. So this starts to give them a little bit more structure without eliminating choice. And we understand why choice is so important, right? So projects can be really flexible in that sense. Depending on your context, depending on your learners in front of you, you can guide more or less. So you can have a list with 10 books, a list with 5 books. Maybe they choose between 2. Maybe you set the book. Or learners we can start the project by having learners to list books. This could be the introduction for the project. It will all depend on how much time you have to develop this project. And then to see how impossible it is to do that in a single lesson, right? So you have to understand, analyze our context to see how much choice we can give them, to see how much time you have to do that, because it can be really frustrating if you don't get to the end of the project, right? And then the next projects they make, it's not going to be so stimulating and so on and so forth. But remember the potential things that I've mentioned, they're also important. All right, so I want to pause a little bit with projects to investigate a little bit more about some characteristics of our beloved teenagers, right? And why do you think I chose this picture to start this conversation about teenagers? You can type in the chat box. I have to say that I love this picture. Noise. Let's see, more ideas. Fun. Hormonal. All right. Is interest. Surprise. Let's see more. Everyone talking in this now. They need to talk. Yes. Expressive. What else? I can see there are more people typing, so wait a little second more. Because they are loud. Live in disagreement. We need to hear them, yes. I say I don't want to do that. Can be. All right, so emotions are all over the place when we talk about teenagers. And they're usually crying out to be heard. And they're crying out for an adult to listen to them, and an adult to listen to them that's not their parents, because they are in a moment in their lives in which they want to find their place in the world outside their families. So what their families think doesn't matter anymore. And sometimes they start doing quite the opposite, because they're testing the waters, right? So they're testing other possibilities. They want to see what the world reserves for them. So that's why it's so common for teenagers to start doing something that is totally opposite from what their families usually do. So, for example, my family doesn't drink much, right? So we used to drink some wine during Christmas, New Year's Eve, birthdays, this kind of things. When I was a teenager, I drank a lot. because it was different from what my parents did. I wanted to understand what it was that to drink. Nowadays, those who know me know that I drink less than my mother now. I drink almost never, just specific moments. So I ended up going back to what was traditional in my family, maybe, right? So, but there was a moment when I would drink a lot. I didn't want my parents to know about that, so I would usually drink a lot and get sober before I got home, because I didn't want the conflict there, but I wanted to test. So teenagers, they want to test things and they are crying for attention. They're not only calling, as Angela put, they are crying. They want attention because they want to be heard. And projects can give them a voice, right? But before we delve into that, I want to explore a little bit more some characteristics from physical characteristics of teenagers. And Bruno mentioned hormones here, right? And we are going to touch upon that, right? So teenagers are going through a turmoil. That's why I chose this picture, right? So this picture, in fact, is the Milky Way, like it's an overexposed Milky Way, but it shows well this turmoil that is teenagers' bodies. So they're going through lots of changes, and these changes involve lots of hormonal changes, and that they have no reference about, so they don't know what's going on. When we are talking about their bodies are changing visually as well, or it's noticeable how it's changing. So boys' voice, for example, starts to change. So they would spend like a couple of years of their teenage years not speaking in front of the whole group. And why is that? Because probably while you're speaking, they will in the middle of the way, and there's nothing they can do about it. The girls' body is changing a lot. That's why sometimes they don't want to be in front of the classroom with their backs to the group, right? Like write something on the board. Some of them won't want that. And they are starting to understand part of their hormonal changes have to do with sexual hormones. So that also influences how they see each other. And then for young teenagers, we have that moment, I don't want to work with that person. Only boys on one side of the classroom, girls on the other side. Why? Because the other is a mystery and they don't feel so comfortable with, right? So lots of changes are going on. This also involves an overactive amygdala, which is a tiny structure in the brain that is responsible for impulse control, emotions, and all of this. And their prefrontal cortex is not fully developed. And the prefrontal cortex is responsible for planning and this kind of things. So these biological changes, they do have impact on teenagers' behavior. In what ways? So when you think of decision making, impulse control, emotions, planning, the ability of seeing things from other people's perspectives, these are all affected by these biological changes. So they have difficulties making decisions because their prefrontal cortex is not fully developed, and also because they don't have reference. As adults, we have been through lots of different situations. And because of that, we know when something is more or less serious. We know maybe 2 or 3 possible ways of dealing with a situation. They don't yet. So it's harder for them to make decisions and to see the consequence of things. So they can see the cause in a better way, but for them to understand the consequence of things, it's harder. They don't have much impulse control as well. So they will say whatever crosses their minds. You have the impression that they hate you, but they don't. And sometimes they have reactions that say, but why did you do that? And it's like, simply, I couldn't help it. And this is biological. They also can't control their emotions anymore. So they may have an emotional outburst in the classroom, sometimes related to something they're learning, sometimes totally unrelated, but life is happening, especially now that we are all connected. Even if they're not checking their mobiles during the lesson, in between lessons they will. And maybe they will notice that their crush hasn't replied to their message. And this can cause a huge outburst of emotions. And for us, from our perspective as adults, we look and say, that's silly, come on. Maybe that happened, and you can think of many other possibilities. And even if the crush hasn't replied, it's not the end of the world. We know that because we had our crushes, we had our broken hearts, we all survived, and we know that's going to be fine. But they don't. They don't have reference of what can happen. So, and this lack of reference aligned with the overactive amygdala results in them being all over the place and crying and getting angry and so on and so forth. They are awful at planning. So if you set an assignment for them for 3 weeks, when will they do that? The day before. We as adults, we also do that sometimes, right? But we can see the consequences better. For them, they will look and say, it's time enough. And it's not. As adults, we know that we are procrastinating. And you know that we're going to have consequences, and we face that. But as teenagers, they truly believe they will have the time. So things that are too long-term are really hard for them to plan. Start thinking about projects, right? Keep that in mind. So if you ask them to plan something, they will be at a loss. They need help to do that because it's something they are developing. And many of us as adults, we also need to develop that. It's something that, at least from my generation, which I'm not going to mention really which one it is, but we didn't learn at school, for example. There wasn't anything at school that would help us prepare and to be planners, to be able to plan for things. This is something that we learned either from our families or from life, from university, maybe from our first job, but school definitely wouldn't prepare us for that. And remember that planning is one of the characteristics of projects. Keep that in mind. And for them, it's really hard to see things from other people's perspective. So sometimes they do something or they say something that can really hurt someone. But they don't see, they do that because they couldn't or they didn't foresee the effect. So we need to help them develop this ability. This is related to the prefrontal cortex as well. We need to help them develop this ability to actually understand the impact of their actions on others. So how other people will feel if you do something. What would be important for example, if they want to be game designers, and they will need to understand what is the perspective, what's going to be the user experience. It's not what is their own experience playing the game they created. No, they have to think about what other people will feel or will react, what's going to be the experience for that. So lots of times teenagers want to pursue paths in life that demands this notion, but they don't know they need this notion. And we as educators can guide them towards that, right? So let's move a little bit forward, right? Because teenagers, I'm talking teenagers, but you notice that I mentioned at some point younger teenagers, and they're going through changes. It's hard to put all the teenagers in the same bowl. And why is that? Younger teenagers are very different from older teenagers. So when they start the puberty process, which is technically when adolescence starts, yes, I agree, Rejane. Teens need to feel they are essential for the project success, and they are essential, actually. So, but they have to notice that. So younger teenagers and older teenagers can be very different. And I want to separate a little bit more these differences, because it will impact the way we deal with them, right? So take a look at A and B. Which of these two descriptions do you think refers to a younger teenager, like 13, 14? Type in the chat box. Type just the letter, A or B. Have A. Who else? Who else? A, old, B, young. Okay. A. B. So have two people for B. So Fabiola and where is it? Jailson, right? And Pedro. Yeah, I would go with Rejane, Pedro, and Jailson, right? So B are younger teens. It's amazing. The younger teens, they are more concerned about being treated as adults than the older teens. So a 13 or 14-year-old, they want to be treated as an adult. The 16, 17 one, I guess that they reach a point in which they start to understand that's going to be more difficult than they had anticipated, and they don't want that much anymore, right? And this development of the analytical skills and to do things more systematically, to learn information about the world, is really the transition between being a child and being a teenager. So these are younger teens. Older teens can be more analytical more easily. They can analyze things in a better way. They're extremely body conscious, because that's when the body changes start. And sometimes they grow up too fast and they feel totally uncomfortable in their own bodies, because suddenly, and sometimes that's the feeling that it was like in a day, and they went to sleep tiny, they woke up giants. and they feel like legs are too long, arms are too long, it's everything weird. So they are more body conscious when they're younger, and they have their own world. Older teenagers, they are more concerned about how can I say, placing themselves in the world that exists, if compared to younger teens. And older teens, peer pressure is higher, their sexual maturity develops. So, and now boys and girls interact, because when they're younger teens, they avoid that at all costs. But they're more rebellious. They want to change the world. They are more idealistic. And this is wonderful for projects, by the way. Let's change the world. What can you do? Right? But they are also more emotional. And they are pretty inclined to take risks. So these are a little bit of the differences between younger and older teens, right? Luciana, I have some recommendations of books about teens and projects and everything on the last slide. It's going to be there for you. Don't worry. So yes, teenagers are all over the place. What kind of risks? Okay, I'll give you an example that comes from my own experience. I noticed that I had grown. Well, I'll give you two examples. First, when I was, remember that I've mentioned that I drank a lot when I was a teenager. That was taking risks, right? And I only understood the risks, one, because I wasn't allowed, right? I don't even remember how I would access alcoholic drinks at that age, because there wasn't at home. There was only wine at home, and so there was a risk to access that. I would go to places that nowadays I look and say, wow, that was dangerous. In terms of urban violence, really. And another example, do you know when we were playing at the swimming pool, and we start pushing and pulling and so on and so forth, these kind of things, I noticed that I had become an adult when I noticed that at that point, while I was still doing that, because I was in my 20s, I was concerned about hitting the edge of the swimming pool. So it was like, when I was a teenager, we would just have fun. Yay! When we were young adults, we started, take care, be careful, no, go to the middle of the swimming pool, and so on and so forth, because we didn't want to take those risks, right? So just to give a couple of examples. Any more questions? Let me see. I guess it's fine. All right, so what are the implications for the classroom? Let me just see Ilana's comment. This is more like breaking rules, living on your own. I think it's more like taking risks. It is as well. And breaking rules, in fact, they are not breaking the rules. Teenagers don't break the rules to take risks, because it's not so much related to risk taking. It has to do with understanding how far they can go. So teenagers, they will, when you are a child and someone says you cannot do this, usually we just accept that. Okay, we cannot do this. When so for example, you cannot cross this line. Okay, we cannot cross this line. When you become a teenager, you start to say, okay, I cannot cross this line, but can I step on this line? Okay, can I go one more step? Nobody said anything. So I'll try another one. And they will start pushing the boundaries. Yes, what if I touch the line? Nothing happened. What if I pass just a little bit more? And they will go until they hit a wall. And that's why for us as teachers, we need to be consistent. So if it's no, it's a no. It doesn't matter if it's the nice student or the troublemaker. A no, it's a no. That's the rule. And we need to be consistent, because then we will go, they will find a wall, and they will be fine with that. And explaining why the rules exist to them will also help them in this development. So this thing of breaking rules is a lot related to finding the boundaries. How far can I go? And it's a very interesting process. And when we switch our mindset related to that, so when we notice that teenagers that are pushing, and we think about that from that perspective, it helps us be more consistent and not take things so personally, because it's not personal. It's not because they don't want to do that for you or anything like that, but it's because they want to know how far they can go. Simply like that, and it's not personal, right? But all of these have classroom implications. Let's see a couple of them, right? So, they are frequently off task. They are prone to emotional outbursts inside the classroom, as I've mentioned. They have an inability to see how their behavior affects others. And they seem to have an excuse for everything. This has to do a lot with their lack of planning. And the excuses, they are genuine. I thought I could do that. I thought I would have enough time. But I don't know, something happened and I couldn't do that the day before. Yes, but you had a month to do that. So we have to help them see that, right? So it has impact. So many times the excuse is there for real because they can't plan. And they usually don't do much homework at home because they don't see, they are bad at planning. They end up getting carried away with other things, and that it's just homework, and they forget about that, right? In this context, how can projects help, right? So projects can first give teenagers a voice. Remember, they are crying for attention. Projects can give them this voice. So in order for that really to happen, we need to listen and respond to them genuinely, for them to feel that they are being heard, that they actually have this voice, and allow them to make decisions. Don't make the decisions for them. Even if you look and you see, my goodness, this is not going to work. It is going to be a disaster. Let them try it. Maybe try it again so we can guide them. Ask them questions. Trigger their thought, but not decide for them. We can help them see possible consequences and establish that. Remember, this is something they are developing, so we can guide them there, but not make the decisions per se. Because if we make the decisions for them, they will never develop this ability, and this is something they need to develop at this age. Or else there will be adults who cannot make decisions. Projects can also help teenagers see things from a different perspective. Remember, another thing they need to develop. So if in their project they're maybe devising a game or making a podcast as the example and so on, we can help them understand, okay, how do you think people will understand that? When you think of the assessment of the project, you can recap that idea as well. So yes, it can help you reinforce what the consequences of some behaviors and attitudes can affect others. And not saying, for example, if they are not collaborating for the outcome of the project, help them understand what the consequences, or what the consequences are, how it's impacting the other people in their group. Ask them, how would you feel if this happened, and so on and so forth. It may happen that they would say, I find it better because of this and that, blah blah blah. But later on, they will have this seed that may grow. So we have to do that consistently. We are not going to have the effect of having them thinking about the other instantaneously. It takes some time and it takes a little bit of consistency. But we need to plant the seeds there, one here, one there, and then they will start developing that. It also helps this sense of responsibility, as Linda mentioned here, right? They are responsible for the outcome of their own project, because we are not making the decisions for them. The importance of letting them choose, right? So we need to raise their awareness of that, to show them that if something didn't work well, it's their responsibility. And it's not the moment to point fingers, because it's not the moment to say, because that person did nothing for the project. Okay, but what was your role in that? What did you do about it? Did you just ignore it? Did you think, it's better because this person knows nothing about that, and I prefer them not to do anything than do something wrong. And then if you decide to do that, at the end, you cannot complain that the person hadn't worked with. So it was your responsibility. And when you guide and you show the possibilities and you ask those questions, then we'll start raising the awareness for their responsibility in their own learning process. Just a second. Sorry about that. What else? Projects can also help teenagers develop planning and decision-making skills. They need help for that. So it's not saying, just do it. You're responsible, plan it, and make your own decisions. No, this is not going to happen, because they need support. They need guidance in that. And something that we can do to help them plan for a project, for example, is to establish milestones, to have short-term goals. So by this day, you need to have defined which book, taking the idea of the book, right, you're going to talk about, you're going to use in your project. By that day, you need to have decided what the format of your project will be. What will you do? Will you do a podcast? Will you do a play? Will you do a web page? Will you do, I don't know, a poem based on the book? It can be anything. Virtually. Will you do a collage? What are you going to produce? But that day, you need to have decided that. By that other day, and so on. So have clear milestones and short-term aims. This will help them get organized, because even if they miss one deadline, so by that day, you need to have defined which book you're going to talk about. if they reach that day and they haven't decided, they will know that they are late and that they have to do something about it, and that they have to make up for the time. And we need to make it clear for them, okay, it's not the end of the world, but you have to compensate this time for the next. If we don't have these milestones and short-term aims, this will happen the day before the presentation. And they will get to the day before the presentation without even knowing what they're going to talk about, which book they're going to focus on. And then it may be too late. Or the result of the project's not going to be, it's going to be suffering because they'll have to rush to do that. And they will end up with a poorer result that potentially they could, right? We are getting to the end, Jason. Don't worry. And it's also an opportunity for teenagers to deal with different emotions, because while they are collaborating and so on, they will need to deal with expectations. So it's important for us to be clear about our expectations, and for us and for them not to take things personally, right? For them to deal with all of these emotions. So if we come to think about the initial question that I asked there in the beginning, so if projects and teenagers are a match made in heaven, I would say they are, because projects will really help teenagers develop and get them engaged and responsible for their own learning process, right? And I have here some recommendations, right? If you want, you can drop me a line to ask for the references. I can send them. You can find me on LinkedIn. You also have Troika's websites there to know a little bit more about it. I'll share my mail as well. Just a second. That's my mail as well. So I know I have plenty of books here and links and articles and everything, but they cover both teenagers and projects, right? So coming back here, I highly recommend this first TED Talk on teenagers, for example, right? It's short and sweet and really interesting. There's an article about projects in teenager classrooms, so take a look. If you need, just drop me a line and I'll send you the references, right? I don't think we have any more time for questions, but I was trying to answer your questions as we went, so I don't think we have any questions left there. Yes. So I would like to thank you very much for joining in for this lovely afternoon, and I hope you can use projects with teenagers as often as possible within your context, right? Thank you very much.